So I'm going to turn this over. I bet you I do go over, but it'll only be by a minute. When my stepsister Sarah ran for Parliament in 2015, people told her it was a fool's errand. She'd been selected by the Liberal Democrats to run in Dover and Deal, a seat where they had never managed more than a distant third. This time round, the prognosis was worse. Now, UKIP was surging, and the Lib Dems, well, they were reaping the rewards of their coalition with the Tories. It had become abundantly clear that parts of their base preferred them to retain their virtue rather than to get embroiled in the messy business of actually governing. So it was obvious Sarah couldn't win, even before her own prognosis darkened. She was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer. She chose to continue her candidacy and campaigned fiercely between bouts of surgery and chemo. She commissioned a wig from the man who made those towering creations for Danny LaRue. "I'll never have a bad hair day again," she said. And she maintained that cheer as her results came through, 3.1% of the vote and a lost deposit. She kept campaigning too, passionately in the first half of 2016 against Brexit. In the second half of the year, she lost another passionate campaign. She died aged 52. The morning of her funeral coincided with Donald Trump's election. "Be glad," said a guest, "that Sarah didn't live to see this." Glad. We need her more than ever, and not only because she was wonderful. She saw the bigger picture. She understood that the turbulence that brought Brexit and Trump entailed clear and present dangers for human rights and for women in particular, but she also saw the opportunity. She understood that the turbulence the turbulence represented a fracturing of the status quo, that for all of the legacy of social progress enshrines at its core vast inequalities. Strong and stable is a lovely place to be if you already have what you need. Most people do not, and most women certainly do not. And that's why women are often the ones hardest hit by turbulence. But all of the biggest leaps for women have also taken place not in times of stability, but of tumult. Enfranchisement, access to labour markets. Think about the world we have now. One set of statistics horribly familiar. 1% of the population owns half the wealth. The poorest half owns just 1%. But there is far less awareness around the gendered nature of that divide. Women make up 40% of the global labour force, yet hold just 1% of capital. Women everywhere are, at best, second-class citizens. Many are doubly or triply disadvantaged by the intersection of factors such as race, age, sexuality, disability, and class. A third of all women will be violently sexually assaulted during their lifetimes, and all of us experience harassment and the constant tinnitus hum of sexism. In the UK, we are theoretically equal under the law, but law is not enough to create equality. Unconscious bias and conscious discrimination hold sway, more often reinforced rather than challenged by our media culture. As a result, we all miss out, men very much included, hemmed in from birth by gendered expectations, locked into destructive modes of behavior, and ill-served by an economy and institutions that, instead of benefiting from all the talents and perspectives available, draw on a small and stagnant pool. Sarah and I didn't actually agree on how to make change always. She had faith in her old party. I co-founded the Women's Equality Party because I believed that for all of the great people in those old parties are part of the problem. I'm impatient for change. Recently, a young journalist, very young, came to interview me. "Will you live to see gender equality?" she asked me. Before I could answer, she interrupted herself. "No, you're too old." I do take her point, but I don't accept it. I believe it's possible to create innovative mechanisms to speed progress. The Women's Equality Party is such a mechanism, and we are developing more. Where Sarah and I were fully aligned is on the continuing value of old-fashioned advocacy. Political participation isn't just about winning and wielding power, though as the Lib Dems, some of them don't seem to understand that is quite important too. It is also about winning arguments over time, doorstep to doorstep, person to person. It's about turning out the progressive vote, even if the progressive vote isn't necessarily for your own party. Sarah understood that the Westminster system wasn't fit for purpose, that it is a club with rules designed by existing members of the club to keep out people that they think are the wrong sort of person. She was not put off by that. Indeed, it redoubled her determination to break open the club. She said something to me shortly before she died. She said, "I have learned in the face of bad stuff not to worry that my words are inadequate or that my actions are trivial. Every word matters, every action counts." She really meant that to comfort the people who were inarticulate in the face of her coming death, but it applies to politics too. I remember watching her campaigning in Dover and Deal, and she was weak and sick, but still she persisted door to door, and she met a woman who was pushing a baby in a pushchair. The woman told her that she was going to vote UKIP, largely on the basis of a TV programme, poverty pornography known as Benefits Britain, that featured a Romanian boasting about cheating the system. Sarah persuaded the woman to think instead about the immigrants she had actually met, and these turned out to be the doctors and nurses in the local hospital who safely delivered that woman's baby. I thought about Sarah a lot during the snap election, the Theresa May's snap election that snapped back. The Lib Dems thought so highly of her that they had selected her to run again in the event of a snap election, even knowing how very seriously ill she was. And for the Women's Equality Party to run felt like a similar act of reckless optimism. We hadn't had time to fundraise or to establish much of a base in the constituencies we were targeting. And first past the post is notoriously expensive and has been shown globally to exclude women and minorities. Our party had, in less than 2 years, amassed 65,000 members and registered supporters. But to win under first past the post, you need that support to be concentrated inside constituencies, which is why, famously, in 2015, UKIP's 4 million votes got them just 1 seat, whereas the SNP's 1.4 million votes got them 56 seats. First past the post is quite simply an undemocratic way of doing democracy. It isn't even good for creating stability, as we are now seeing. It just creates a very nasty, divisive politics. The critics of fairer proportional systems try and scare you. They will tell you that PR would have led to a UKIP government. No, it wouldn't. What it would have done is enable UKIP to break through faster, possibly in greater numbers, and to have shown themselves more quickly for the utter clowns that they are. The Conservatives and Labour both want to retain first past the post. It does enable them to exclude other voices, and it enabled them to present the snap election as a binary choice between two parties. There is a binary contest going on. It isn't between two parties. It is global, it is existential, and it is between progressive and regressive values. It is the contest that in this country sees the current government now propped up by a party with a horrendous record of opposing women's reproductive rights and LGBT+ rights. It is the contest that in America and around the world is seeing the unpicking of rights and protections that women thought secure. Lovely, isn't it? So the weakness of mainstream politics is making room for malign populism, but that weakness is actually masked by systems designed to resist change, whether that change is good or bad. In the UK, the rules meant to ensure broadcaster impartiality during elections decide which parties are allowed to allowed to appear, and how much, according to historical electoral data, which is obviously not very good for a new party. It reinforces the inequities of first past the post. It is why UKIP's death throes were splattered all over your screens and the Greens hardly got a look in. The print press tends to follow that lead. They, in many cases, just magnified again that bias. And of course, everybody called the election wrong. But then again, how should anybody in the media really have that sense of what was going on, that appetite for change in the wider population? Because journalism, like politics, is a club largely populated by white, affluent men. I know that because I'm a recovering journalist myself. I also know it because I have seen far too often the blank stares of those men in the media as I've attempted to explain to them the urgency of the fight for women's equality. It is the same blank stare that thinks that childcare is just a women's issue and that relegates stories about the biggest global inequality there is between men and women to the lifestyle pages. For that reason, for the Women's Equality Party to run looked at least as much of a fool's errand as Sarah's 2015 adventure, and for that reason, we absolutely had to run. We fielded 7 candidates, 4 in constituencies where we hoped to develop them for the future, and 3 where we thought we could make more of an impact. Our marvellous party leader, Sophie Walker, stood against Philip Davis in Shipley. That was a seat Labour had largely given up on after serial defeat. But when we entered the contest in Progressive Alliance, backed by the Green Party, they refused the idea of working with us, and indeed they rejected any possibility of alliances across the country. I think if they had done differently, they would be in government now. In Shipley, the way it played out was that Philip Davis saw his 10,000 seat majority halved. Sadly not eradicated, but halved. A lot of this was down to the Corbyn effect. People voted for Labour with much more enthusiasm than they had before, but it was also because we knocked 31,000 doors and made the progressive case so well. Labour got elated about us standing in Shipley, but even more so when we announced Nimco Alley to stand in Hornsey and Wood Green. They said, you can't do that, we've got a woman there. Contest between progressive women seems like a great thing to me. However, obviously the reason we'd chosen Hornsey and Wood Green is because of that old devil first past the post. We happen to have quite a lot of members there, and you have to stand where your members are. Moreover, we had a manifesto that was much more transformational than any of the other parties. It was the only one that saw social care not as some kind of unfortunate expense, but as a potential motor of the economy. It was the only one that saw women and valued the work women do, paid and unpaid. So standing there made sense, but the critics who queued up to shout at Nimco didn't see that, and among the reasons they told her she shouldn't stand were that the other candidate was supposedly good on refugees, ignoring Nimco's own experience as a child refugee from Somalia, ignoring her campaigning against Yarl's Wood, ignoring her own experience of female genital mutilation and amazing campaigning she's done against that, and ignoring her perspectives as a young black Muslim woman. Something similar went on in Vauxhall, where our candidate Harini Iyengar stood against the Brexit-supporting Kate Hoey. Sorry, say Kate Hoey, I have to have a drink. There it was largely white men queuing up to tell Harini and the Green candidate, who was another Asian woman, that they should stand aside for the male Lib Dem candidate. Women are forever being told to stand aside. They don't always ask us nicely. In the final days of the campaign, our office received hundreds of abusive phone calls, including threats of violence. NIMCO got a death threat, a letter full of Islamophobia, and signed Joe Cox. None of our candidates won, but they're all winners, as Sarah was, because the taking part really matters. The going out on the doorstep, the pushing back against the people who tell you shouldn't take up the space, but also the winning arguments over time on electoral reform, on gender equality, on real diversity and inclusion. And the thing that also matters is visibility. So I'd like to leave you with a photo that I took on the day of the last day of the election. It was the day after NIMCO had received the death threat, and there she was, decked out in party colours, meeting as many people as possible, making the case. And she met a little girl, and that little girl now knows that politics doesn't need to look like that. It can look like this, very much like her. So right now we have an unparalleled opportunity to make faster progress towards that more diverse, more inclusive, better, richer politics because of the current turbulence. We have to embrace that opportunity. We need to seize the turbulence. My sister Sarah did not live to see gender equality, but it isn't enough for the rest of us to hope to do so. We have to work towards it, and I will do so in her memory. Thank you.